Picture this. The most hated traitor in history might not have been a traitor at all. Judas Iscariot is remembered as the greatest traitor in history, but there's an ancient text the church tried to erase that says he was the only one who understood Jesus. A bank vault in Paynesville, Ohio. Not a museum, not an archive, not a climate-controlled preservation facility staffed by conservators in white cotton gloves. A bank vault, the kind designed to protect money, not ancient Coptic manuscripts, not fragments of papyrus so delicate that a single degree of humidity can destroy them. Inside that vault, sitting in the dark, sealed in a box, is a leather-bound manuscript, 3rd century, written in Coptic on papyrus that has survived 1700 years of Egyptian desert conditions. It has survived Roman persecution. It has survived the early church's bonfire of everything they didn't want you to read. It has survived the silence of centuries, buried in a limestone container, waiting. And now it is sitting in a bank vault in Ohio, deteriorating. Page by page, fragment by fragment, sentence by sentence, going to dust, because the asking price was too high and nobody could agree on a number. What is being destroyed in that vault is not just a text, it is the other side of the story you have been told your entire life. The story of Judas Iscariot is one of the oldest stories in Western civilization. Betrayal, greed, 30 pieces of silver, a kiss in a garden at night, and then a name so synonymous with treachery that 2,000 years later, calling someone a Judas still means exactly what it always meant. You have absorbed this story. Most people have. Even if you've never read a gospel in your life, you know that Judas is the villain. But there is a text, ancient, authenticated, dated by scholars to the 3rd or 4th century, that tells the same story, same characters, same garden, same night, same kiss. And in that version, Judas is not the villain. In that version, Judas is the only disciple who understood what Jesus actually came to do. And that text spent 16 years rotting in an Ohio bank vault. Here is the question this episode is going to ask, and I want you to sit with it before we go any further. When Jesus sat privately with Judas, in the dark, away from the other 11, and told him what was going to happen and why and what he needed Judas to do, was that a betrayal or was that a commission? Because the Greek word that appears in every gospel, the word that has been translated for 2,000 years as betray, does not mean betray. It never did. This is Weird World Files, where history meets the unexplained. I have spent a long time with this text, and I want to be honest with you. It unsettled me, not because it's fringe, not because it's speculative, but because the evidence is methodical, the scholarship is serious, and the implications, once you let them land, are very difficult to walk back from. This episode is the one this series has been building toward. If you've been with us from the beginning, Sophia's fall, the demiurge, the Archon system, the reincarnation trap, the divine spark, the 11 years Jesus spent teaching Mary Magdalene what is on the other side, you already hold more of this story than you know. Before we go in, wherever in the world you're watching this, whatever time it is there right now, drop it in the comments. I read every single one, and it genuinely amazes me how far these files reach. Across continents, across time zones, across people who never should have found each other but did, because they carry the same questions. If you're new here, subscribe now. This series goes places most channels won't follow. Now, let's begin. In the last episode, we opened the Pistis Sophia, the 4-volume record of 11 years of private teaching after the resurrection. Jesus sitting with his disciples, going through the full cosmological architecture of reality. Not in parables, not in metaphor, in detail. Mary Magdalene asked more questions than all the male disciples combined. She asked about the Archon checkpoints. She asked about the cup of forgetfulness, the mechanism that strips a returning soul's memory of the pleroma before placing it back into a new body. Jesus confirmed it, named it, gave her the full map. Everything this series built, confirmed in first-person dialogue by the central figure of the Christian tradition. It didn't make it into the Bible. And at the end of that episode, we left you with something, a manuscript found in Egypt in 1978, a gospel attributed to Judas Iscariot, in which Jesus doesn't tell Judas to betray him. He asks, privately, deliberately, because Judas was the only one of the 12 who understood what had to happen and why. And that's where we begin. The manuscript, now known as the Codex Chakos, has one of the most extraordinary physical histories of any document recovered in the modern era. In the mid-1970s, Egyptian farmers digging near the region of Minya stumbled across a limestone box. Inside was a leather-bound codex, 4 ancient texts written in Coptic on papyrus, 3rd century AD. The condition, at the moment of discovery, was remarkable. 1,700 years in the Egyptian desert, and the pages were largely intact. What happened next is one of the great scandals in the history of biblical scholarship. The Codex entered Cairo's antiquities black market. It changed hands. It was smuggled to Europe. A Greek antiquities dealer attempted to sell it to scholars. The asking price was $3 million. No institutional buyer could raise the funds or justify the expenditure. The Codex was transported to the United States. It was placed first in a safety deposit box in Hicksville, New York. Then it was moved to a bank vault in Painesville, Ohio, and there it sat for 16 years. Not in a museum, not in a university archive, in a bank vault, in conditions that were cold, damp, and entirely unsuited to the preservation of ancient papyrus. Every year that passed, fragments continued to break away from the pages. Every year, sentences disappeared. Every year, the margin for understanding what the text actually said got a little narrower. And this is the detail that stopped me when I first encountered it. The most important Gnostic text about Judas Iscariot, the text that was burned by the early church, suppressed for 18 centuries, hidden underground in a limestone container for over a millennium, miraculously rediscovered, spent 16 years being slowly destroyed. Not by persecution, not by fire, not by the forces of orthodoxy who had spent 2,000 years trying to erase it, by a real estate transaction, by a price nobody could agree on. In 2000, the Maecenas Foundation acquired the Codex and brought in Coptic scholar Rodolfo Casa, one of the world's foremost experts in ancient Coptic, to lead the restoration. What Casa found when he opened the container told the story of those 16 years in Ohio immediately. Between 10 and 15% of the text was gone. Not damaged, not partially legible, gone, turned to dust. In a bank vault nobody checked. The team worked for years, reassembling thousands of fragments, piecing together a coherent text from what remained. In 2006, National Geographic published the first modern translation. It became a global sensation. Front pages, television documentaries, the headline that ran around the world, Judas was the hero all along. But here is something most of the coverage never mentioned. The text that provoked all of this, the physical object at the center of the sensation, had been known to the church for almost 2,000 years before anyone in Ohio put it in a vault. Not suspected, not rumored, known. And we know this because one of the church's own men wrote it down. In 180 AD, Irenaeus of Lyon, one of the most important early church fathers, one of the architects of Christian orthodoxy, wrote a catalogue of every Gnostic heresy he could identify. The document is called Against Heresies. It is a detailed, systematic attempt to name and discredit every tradition that threatened the version of Christianity the church was trying to establish. Among the sects he describes is a group called the Cainites. They venerated the figures mainstream tradition condemned, Cain, the Sodomites, Esau, as secret holders of Gnosis whom the Old Testament God persecuted precisely because of their knowledge. And Irenaeus notes in his documentation of the Cainites that they possessed a text, a gospel, attributed to Judas Iscariot. Irenaeus wrote this down in 180 AD, believing presumably that the act of naming a heresy was part of destroying it. What he actually did was leave behind the oldest written proof that the Gospel of Judas existed, that it was circulating, that it was being actively used by a living community of believers almost 2,000 years ago. The Codex Chakos found in Egypt is almost certainly the same text Irenaeus was trying to suppress, which means the Church has known about this gospel for 18 centuries, and for 18 centuries it made sure you didn't. Think about what it took to get here. 1700 years in the desert, a limestone box, Egyptian farmers who almost certainly had no idea what they'd found, a black market, a Greek dealer, a safety deposit box in New York, 16 years in Ohio, a painstaking restoration, a 2006 publication, all of that, just to get back to a text that one man read in 180 AD and decided the world wasn't allowed to see. I want to stop here for a moment because this is the question that stays with me. If Judas was simply the villain the Church has always presented, the greedy, faithless traitor, why spend 18 centuries suppressing a document that says otherwise? Why does a heresy require that much effort to erase? What did the Church know about this text that made it dangerous enough to spend 2 millennia making sure it never reached you? Drop your answer below. I'll be reading. Let me take you inside the text itself, because the opening scene of the Gospel of Judas is unlike anything in the canonical tradition, and it tells you immediately what kind of document this is. Jesus arrives to find his disciples gathered. They are performing a prayer of thanksgiving over bread, the Eucharist, the central ritual of the tradition that would eventually become the Church. They are doing exactly what they are supposed to do. They are being good disciples. Jesus watches them, and then he laughs. Not a gentle smile, not a warm reaction to their devotion. The text is unambiguous. He laughs at them, and the disciples are offended. They confront him. "Master, why are you laughing at our prayer of thanksgiving? We have done what is right." Jesus answers, "I am not laughing at you. You are not doing this because of your own will, but because it is through this that your God will be praised." The disciples are troubled. They ask, "Master, who is our God?" And Jesus says, "The one you know from your tradition. Yaldabaoth, the false creator, the prison architect." In the opening scene of this text, Jesus arrives, watches his disciples perform their most sacred ritual, and laughs, not at them, at the God they're praying to, because he knows, and he's about to tell Judas, that the God the 12 disciples worship is not the true God of the Pleroma. It is the demiurge, the one this series has been describing since the beginning, the one who built the material world as a cage and convinced the souls inside it that the cage was the whole of reality. Not one of the 12 understands this, except one. Later in that same scene, Jesus pulls Judas aside, not in front of the group, alone, away from the others. And what he says to Judas is the thesis of the entire text, the sentence that, when it was published in 2006, stopped scholars cold. "Step away from the others, and I shall tell you the mysteries of the kingdom, not so that you will go there, but you will grieve a great deal." 2 details in that sentence, and both of them require you to stop. First, step away from the others. In the canonical tradition, Peter is the rock on whom the Church is built. John is the beloved disciple. Matthew, Luke. These are the men whose versions of events became scripture. In this text, the text that was burned, suppressed, buried, and then deteriorated in a bank vault, when Jesus wants to give the private teaching, when he chooses the one disciple capable of receiving what he actually came to give, he does not choose Peter, he does not choose John, he chooses Judas. Second, you will grieve a great deal. This is not a promise of reward. Jesus is not offering Judas glory or elevated status. He is warning him. He is saying, true knowledge has a cost. Once you understand what this cosmos actually is, how it was built, who built it, what your soul is doing inside it, you cannot unknow it. Judas will see clearly what the other 11 cannot see, and that clarity will cost him everything. The text doesn't say Judas was better than the others. It says he was the only one who could bear to know. There is a difference. Gnosis isn't a reward, it's a weight. Jesus warns him immediately. Judas takes the knowledge anyway. That choice is the entire story. Now, this is the moment I need to show you something that most documentaries about this text never go deep enough to cover. because the Gospel of Judas did not introduce the idea that Judas might not be a simple villain. That idea was already there, hiding in plain sight in the texts the Church kept. In every canonical Gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, there is a word used to describe what Judas did, and that word, in every Bible you have ever held, has been translated as betray. The Greek word is paradidomi. Here is what paradidomi actually means: to hand over, to deliver, to transfer custody. It is a neutral word, a transactional word, a logistical word. It carries no inherent moral weight in the direction of treachery. The Greek word that specifically means betray, the word that carries the connotation of disloyalty, of breaking faith, of violation, is prodidomi. Prodidomi does not appear in any Gospel's account of what Judas did, not one. And here is what makes this forensic finding so devastating. Paradidomi, the same word used for Judas, is used throughout the New Testament for acts that are unambiguously positive. Jesus handed over the bread at the Last Supper. That is paradidomi. Paul handed over the tradition and the teachings to the churches he founded. That is paradidomi. In Romans, God handed over his own Son for the sake of humanity. That is also paradidomi, the same word. And there is one more piece of evidence from the canonical record that the Church has never adequately explained. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians is the oldest written testimony about Judas we have. It predates the Gospels. Written approximately 55 AD, it describes the appearances of the risen Christ, and Paul writes that Christ appeared first to Peter and then to the 12, not the 11, the 12. If Judas is dead, damned, condemned to eternal separation from God as a consequence of his treachery, why does Paul, writing before any gospel was composed, place him among the witnesses to the resurrection? No one who wrote a gospel used the Greek word that means betray. They used the word that means hand over, the same word used for God handing over his Son. For 2,000 years, every Bible you have ever held translated it as betrayal. That is not a translation. That is a verdict, and it was delivered without a trial. If this is resonating with you, hit the like button right now. It tells the algorithm this kind of content matters, and it helps us keep going deeper. Now we go inside the teaching itself, because after Jesus separates Judas from the others, what happens next is not a brief conversation. It is an extended, systematic, private cosmological education. Jesus takes Judas through the full architecture of reality, from the pleroma at the top to the material world at the bottom, in a session that the other 11 disciples will never receive. And if you have been watching this series from the beginning, I need you to pay attention to what I'm about to say, because this is the moment the series was always building toward. Jesus describes to Judas the barbello, the first emanation of the true God, the divine feminine principle of the pleroma. We have spent 2 episodes with Sophia, the lower emanation, the one whose fall created the conditions for the demiurge. The barbello is the source above Sophia, the first expression of the true God's creative nature, the original. He describes the 12 luminaries, the true divine beings of the pleroma, the real 12, the eternal ones, contrasted deliberately against the 12 disciples sitting in the next room who unknowingly worship their counterfeit versions. The structural parallel is intentional, and it is devastating once you see it. He describes the chaos of the material cosmos, Yaldabaoth's domain, the bounded, finite system of matter and suffering that the demiurge constructed in imitation of the pleroma, believing he had created something real when what he had built was a prison dressed as a world. You know this. You have been here. He describes the 5 planets as archon stations, the post-death checkpoint system, the soul's journey upward after physical death, through each sphere, past each archon, each demanding passwords, assessing the soul's accumulated weight, deciding its fate. The reincarnation mechanism, the trap, the cup of forgetfulness waiting at the end of the cycle for every soul that doesn't make it through. You know all of this. And here is what I need you to understand about that fact. The private knowledge Jesus gives to Judas alone in the dark, away from the other 11, is the same knowledge you have spent this entire series assembling. You know the barbello, you know the archons, you know the soul trap, you know the cup of forgetfulness, you know how the reincarnation mechanism works, you know the demiurge's name and what he believed about himself and why he was wrong. You have spent 9 episodes learning exactly what Jesus taught Judas in secret, in one private session 2,000 years ago. The Church buried this text so that knowledge would never reach you. You are receiving it now. And now I need to show you the other side of the translation debate, because what happened after National Geographic published the Gospel of Judas in 2006 is one of the most significant scholarly controversies in modern biblical studies, and most people have never heard of it. When the National Geographic translation appeared, the world got a clear headline: Judas was the hero. Jesus asked Judas to hand him over. Judas complied out of understanding, out of knowledge, out of love. The translation of the central line implied a positive commission, an act of gnosis rather than an act of greed. And then in 2007, a scholar named April DeConnick, professor of biblical studies at Rice University, published a detailed retranslation of the Coptic original. Her conclusion: the National Geographic team had mistranslated a key word. In DeConnick's reading, the word translated as exceed, as in you will exceed all of them, actually carries a connotation closer to be set apart or be cursed. The line about Judas's star leading him astray is not metaphorical admiration. It is a warning, a condemnation. In DeConnick's reading, the Gospel of Judas is not a celebration of Judas at all. It is a Scythian text that uses Judas as a cautionary example, a warning against those who believe that physical martyrdom alone can achieve spiritual liberation. In this interpretation, Judas is still wrong. He is just wrong in a different way than the Church said he was. 2 professional translators, 1 ancient manuscript, diametrically opposite conclusions. The debate has never been fully resolved, and this is the detail I keep returning to. The 16 years in that Ohio bank vault, the humidity, the cold, the fragments that became dust, did not merely damage a curiosity. They removed words from a text that, as it turns out, we cannot fully read even when intact. 10 to 15% of the Gospel of Judas is gone, and what remains is ambiguous enough that 2 serious scholars can extract opposite meanings from it. The vault completed what the Church started. It took away the words. But something survives. And what survives points in a direction that the canonical record, on its own, without the Gospel of Judas, cannot fully explain away. Let me give you the line that appeared in the 2006 translation and became the most quoted sentence from the Gospel of Judas. After Jesus takes Judas through the full cosmological map, after he has shown him the barbello and the archons and the nature of the material world and the soul trap and the cup of forgetfulness, after Judas has received the complete private education that the other 11 will never have, Jesus says, "You will exceed all of them, for you will sacrifice the man that clothes me." Let's sit with that for a moment. The man that clothes me. In the Gnostic understanding you now hold, this is not a difficult phrase to interpret. The man that clothes the divine Christ is the material body, the flesh, the biological vehicle that contains the divine spark of the Logos, the fragment of true light that descended into matter. In the cosmological architecture you have watched this series build across 9 episodes, the material body is not the self. It is the garment, the temporary housing, the cage that the divine spark wears while it is trapped in the demiurge's world. For the divine spark to return to the pleroma, for Christ's light to go home, the material garment must be removed. And in the Gnostic framework, removing a divine spark from its material prison is not an act of violence. It is an act of liberation. This is where the 2,000-year verdict against Judas collapses under its own logic. In the mainstream tradition, the crucifixion is the most tragic event in human history. The murder of God, the act of ultimate betrayal, the wound that stains Judas forever. In the Gnostic cosmological framework, the crucifixion is the liberation of the divine spark from its final material prison. It is the completion of the mission, the moment the light gets out. Two different frameworks, two completely different meanings for the same event. And here is what makes the Gnostic position internally coherent in a way the mainstream tradition has always struggled with. If the crucifixion was necessary, if it was always going to happen, if it was the point of the entire incarnation, then the person who made it possible is not a villain. He is the person who did what was asked of him. Not Peter, who denied him 3 times in the courtyard. Not John, who wept at the cross. Not Mary, who came to the tomb. Not Matthew or Luke or Philip or Thomas. Judas, the one who stepped away from the others when Jesus asked. The one who took the knowledge even when Jesus warned him it would make him grieve. The one who understood, when no one else did, what had to happen and why. The one who picked up the 30 pieces of silver and walked into the garden and did the thing that liberated the divine spark from its final material prison, and then spent 2,000 years having his name used as a synonym for treachery. In every language on earth. Now let me show you one more piece of evidence. And this one doesn't come from the Gnostic texts. It comes from the canonical Gospels themselves, the texts the Church kept. In Matthew 19:28, Jesus speaks to his disciples and makes a promise. He says, "Truly I tell you, at the renewal of all things, when the Son of Man sits on his glorious throne, you who have followed me will also sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel." 12 thrones, 12 disciples. Judas was one of the 12 when Jesus said this. Think about what that means for the Church's version of this story. If Judas is the damned betrayer, the agent of evil, the man whose treachery condemns him to eternal separation from God, why does Jesus, in Matthew, promise him a throne? The Church's answer has always been that Jesus knew what Judas would do and chose him anyway. That Judas was foreknown, that his role was prophetically necessary, that it had to happen this way. But if you choose someone to fulfill a prophecy, if you know what they will do, if you need them to do it, if the entire mission depends on them doing it, and they do it, and you promised them a throne for following you, is that a betrayal? Or is that exactly what was asked of them? The Church cannot answer that question. The Gospel of Judas can. Every story about a prison needs a jailer. Every story about a rescue needs someone who opens the door. For 2,000 years, the story of Jesus and the story of Judas have been told as one story. Hero and villain, light and dark, loyalty and betrayal. The names on opposite sides of the ledger, the saint and the sinner, the one who was right and the one who was wrong. The Gospel of Judas says something different. It says the story only works because Judas was willing to be the villain, to take the silver, to take the kiss in the garden, to take 2,000 years of his name meaning treachery in every language on earth, so that the divine spark inside a carpenter from Galilee could go home. The Gnostics preserved this text because they understood something the Church spent 18 centuries trying to erase. The most dangerous idea in religious history is not that Judas was evil, it's that he was asked, and he said, yes. Let that land. If this series is doing something for you, if these investigations are reaching something you've carried quietly for a long time, sharing it with someone who carries the same questions is the most powerful thing you can do. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you for the next episode. The text at the root of everything this series has ever said. Before we go, everything this series has shown you, Sophia's fall, the birth of Yaldabaoth, the Archon system, the soul trap, the cup of forgetfulness, the divine spark inside you, the 11 years of teaching Jesus gave Mary Magdalene, the private cosmological revelation he gave to Judas. It all came from somewhere. One text, the oldest and most complete Gnostic document ever found. Scholars call it the most important text in the entire Nag Hammadi library. Some call it the Bible of Gnosticism. In it, Jesus appears to the Apostle John in a vision after the resurrection, alone. And he says something that stops the entire text cold. I am the one who is with you always. I am the Father. I am the Mother. I am the Son. And then he gives John what he gave Judas, what he gave Mary, what he has apparently been giving privately to whoever was ready to receive it. The complete map, not fragments, not excerpts, not echoes heard across 13 other texts. The full systematic, chapter-by-chapter, name-by-name account of how the cosmos was built, who built it, who corrupted it, how your soul got inside it, what happens after you die, and how the divine spark finds its way home. This series has been built, piece by piece, from a single source text. Next time, we read the source. The Apocryphon of John, the secret revelation, the text that contains everything. You've been living inside it since episode 1. This is Weird World Files, where history meets the unexplained. I'll see you there. Thanks for watching.